Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Mission Podcast. We are on a mission to encourage and inspire you as you're navigating through this life and with your relationship with Christ. My name is Rebecca Toomey, and today I am joined again by the handsomest co-host there is, and that is my husband, Michael Toomey.
Hello. I really appreciate your intro that you've been giving me.
Yeah, you like that?
Yeah, it's really nice.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me again. So this episode, guys, is pre-recorded. Mike and I are recording this obviously before today's date that it's coming out. We are actually recording this on Easter Sunday. So I just had to share that because Mike and I are matching. If you're on YouTube right now, you'll see we have matching outfits on. And our kids matched with us too. It was really cute. Mike is a good sport. He will wear the things that I get from the store and matching outfits. So husbands, take note.
Yeah, I don't even complain at all. See, the thing is, I'm really honored that I get included in the matching because there's been a couple of events or family outings and stuff like that you and Brooke will match or you and the kids will match. And I'm like, what about me? And so I'm just honored that I get included in the matching now.
Oh, you like to match with us now.
I love it. Wouldn't have it any other way, honey.
Well, I love it. Well, before we get into today's topic, I wanted to give you a chance to circle back on something that you had mentioned to me you wanted to readdress. In a previous episode, you made a statement about how you didn't understand why Jesus had to be sacrificed, why God had to send his son, that it was a great mystery. And I think you've had a revelation about that over the last couple of weeks as we've been studying Matthew. So did you want to share that?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for the opportunity. So it's really interesting, right? We had that conversation a couple of weeks ago, and not too long after, I think because at church we've been reading through the book of Matthew, and we've just gotten to the end of where Jesus has been handed over and betrayed and is crucified. And something really just spoke to me that I started to understand a little more that he was sacrificed for us, and the Lamb of God. This in the Old Testament we see blood sacrifices of an unspotted lamb and things like that, and this was kind of the equivalent, that he sent his only son to die for our sins, a death that we deserved, and that he took that upon himself. And it really was just such a beautiful, amazing expression. And I still think that there is a lot that we can't fully grasp that just goes so beyond our understanding, but I really find it beautiful and moving that this is what he did for us, and that this is what's written, and that's also what we remember at Easter. So it's really good timing for us to be talking about that.
Mm. So I think what you're saying is you kind of didn't necessarily understand why it had to be Jesus, why it had to be a human sacrifice. But after we've gone through some more of what we've gone through, you are able to see the prophecy in it being a blood sacrifice, that it is the ultimate sacrifice, that for many, many, many years, people sacrificed animals to the Lord. And that was, the way that we showed the Lord that, I shouldn't say we because we weren't there, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
that
people, humans
that humans showed their, what is the word I'm looking for here?
showed their reverence. They sacrificed. Yeah, there were sacrifices throughout history, and this was the ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah. Well, good. I wanted us to circle back on that because I know you wanted to mention it. And for those that, if you're listening and you just jumped into this series for the first time today, we're in a relationship series and it's focused on growing together. And so far, we have discussed the 5 love languages, the crazy cycle from love and respect. So if you're interested in that, be sure to listen back. Embracing oneness and learning to love like Christ. And today, we're going to be talking about extending grace to our spouse. We will talk about what grace is, when and how to extend it, and how it can be the little thing that you might not have realized you needed in your marriage. It's an interesting conversation. It's not one of those things that you sit around and talk about necessarily with other couples or with your girlfriends. Like, hey, let's talk about grace. What am I doing wrong in my relationship? It's grace. But after you and I have gone through a study of grace with Reengage, you actually told me just today that you think that this is the most important aspect of a relationship. So I'll let you address that, but let's start with what grace is. In 2 words, it's undeserved love. And I think you mentioned to me unconditional love, which I think we could argue that they're one and the same, but let's see what the Bible has to say. In Ephesians 2:8, it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not of your own doing. It is a gift of God." In Christian theology, it is said that grace is the spontaneous, unmerited gift of the divine favor in the salvation of sinners. And I wanted to share something from an article about grace by Britannica, of all resources. It states, the English term is the usual translation for the Greek charis, which occurs in the New Testament about 150 times. 2/3 of these in writings attributed to St. Paul. Although the word must sometimes be translated in other ways, the fundamental meaning in the New Testament and in subsequent theological usage is that contained in the letter of Paul to Titus. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all. And that's Titus 2:11. From the time of the early church, Christian theologians have developed and clarified the biblical concept of grace. The word grace is the central subject of 3 great theological controversies. The first is that of the nature of human depravity and regeneration. Number 2, that of the relation between grace and free will. And number 3, that of the, quote, means of grace between Catholics and Protestants, i.e., whether the efficacy of the sacraments as channels of the divine grace is dependent on good works performed or dependent on the faith of the recipient. End quote. Now, we're not going to get into a debate about these theological controversies today, especially the whole by works thing, because I think that if you're listening to this podcast, you probably understand that by grace we are saved and not through works. But instead, I'd like us to focus on what the Bible has to say about grace and what that has to do with marriage. So the article above mentions, or the article that I just communicated, it uses grace and mentions that it's used a lot in the New Testament. I'm not going to read every verse, but I do want to read a few that really stuck out to me. So let's start with 2 Corinthians 12:9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. In Ephesians 2, verses 8-9, it says, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not of your own doing. It is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. In Romans 6, verse 14, it says, for sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under the law, but under grace. Romans 11:6, but if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. In James 4:6, but he gives more grace. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. In John 1:16, it says, for from his fullness we have received grace upon grace. Romans 5:8, but God shows his love for us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And lastly, Titus 2:11 through 14, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself to us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. All right. So after reading all those verses, I would say undeserved love is a pretty good description, right?
Absolutely. It definitely is. All those really are striking on the same vein of look at what he's done for us, even though we were undeserving, even when we were still sinners, that he came and died for us is really, it's really moving to me. It's something that I've never really thought about until fairly recently, within the last couple of months in our study of Matthew again. It's definitely something that I haven't thought of until now, and it really strikes me and moves my heart to think about the what we've been given. It's such a beautiful gift to have this grace that we've been given.
Exactly. And I think that that's why we are focused on this from a marriage perspective, because the Lord so graciously grants grace to us. He extends grace. And so us extending grace is us emulating him. It's us emulating Christ. And when it comes to marriage, grace is not about focusing on the faults of our spouse, but seeing the best in them. That's how we can extend grace. It's choosing to believe the best about, your words and your actions. It's also advocating for you, advocating for our spouse, extending kindness, even when it might not be deserved. There is a lot in a lot of those verses about works by works, that you can't good work your way out of it, because there are going to be times when you're not doing good works towards the Lord, and yet he still extends grace. And I think that that's where this correlation comes into marriage, right? Like, we don't always act kindly to our spouse. We don't always say the right things or give the right attitude. Sometimes we act like a jerk. And it's up to our spouse. It's up to you, being my spouse, to decide, I'm going to let this go, or I'm going to meet her tone, or, whatever the case might be. And I think that really grace is responding kindly, even when the other person isn't speaking kindly. It's loving each other, not because of the way that I act or the way that you act or what we do, but in spite of it.
That's all true. I really, the undeserving versus unconditional love, I do feel like they're pretty much one and the same. I think undeserving makes more sense in the way that God loves us, and I think unconditional love makes more sense for the marriage. I really do believe that grace is the most important piece of any relationship, in family, in a marriage, with your children. It's unconditional love, because you don't love them if, or you don't love them because they did this or that. You love them no matter what. You love them on their good days and on their bad days. And I really think that's the most beautiful thing about love. True love. True love is unconditional love.
I think grace goes a little further than that, though. It's more than just loving someone anyway. It's treating them kindly, even when. And
Yeah.
I don't want to throw you under the bus, but I want to give an example of the other day, this came up, and you hadn't read what I had prepared for this conversation yet. We talked about grace, because we did it in our class, but our daughter was not being very nice. And you said something to her. Do you remember what that was that you said?
Yeah.
Do you want to say it or do you want me to say it?
I mean, you're telling the story, so take it away.
So she wasn't being very nice. And you said something like, you're being mean to me. You're not being nice to me. So I'm not going to be nice to you. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. This is not okay. This is first of all, 3-year-old. We need to practice grace right now. We need to extend grace. And I'm not saying this to say I'm better than you or anyone, because I have my moments where I do not extend grace and where I need a reminder too. I think the reason I want to mention this example is because it was a moment for all of us where we could go, whoa, whoa, wait a second. No, this is a moment where we can all learn about what grace is together. That even though you're not being nice to daddy, he's going to be nice to you, and he's going to help you with what you need help with. And so it's a small example, but I think that this shows up in our marriage more than probably anything, which is why, well, this and forgiveness, which is next week. But that's probably why you feel like it's so important, because if we don't extend grace to each other, then what?
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into forgiveness when we do, but I think that without grace, there is no forgiveness. I think that you need some grace to grant forgiveness. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it comes first, and sometimes you don't even need the forgiveness because you have enough grace to just let things go, you know. But that thing with Brooke, I was not feeling graceful that day. I was at my wit's end with her. I was not feeling the grace.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you just need a little bit of a reminder that, hey, she's watching and she's going to learn whatever it is that you say to her. She listens and she repeats it. And so it's very important for us, not just in our marriages, but with our children, to teach and talk about these topics, even when they're little, because even if they don't understand it, they're going to repeat what they hear. They're very repetitive. So I think that this is the kind of thing like, hey, somebody is mean to you. You don't act mean back to them. You act kindly. You meet their anger with kindness. And it's not easy. It's a challenge, but it's what's going to stop that crazy cycle. Because how easy is it that if somebody's snarky or nasty or like, why did you do that? The easiest thing in the world to do is go on the defense and be like, well, because, what takes way more control and, self-control is staying cool, staying calm, which is actually something that I really admire about you, is that you are the calm, cool one. And I'm usually the hot one.
Usually, but we all have our days.
Yeah.
Sometimes I can't. Sometimes I just can't be cool. I'm just boiling. I'm human, But
Yep.
that's something that we've talked about with tone matching, is that sometimes I read your tone
Mm-hmm.
as negative, and then I start getting heated up too.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the best things that we've usually had in our relationship, especially early on, was that you would get hot and I would cool you down. But now I just got to blow off some steam because I'm just hot too. It's hard for me to radiate all that heat when I've been boiling up for 5 years, 10 years now.
Well, in some ways
Not
it
as
is.
easy.
Yeah, in some ways it is kind of like, I think that, and this is something that we haven't talked about in this marriage series, but I think it's very important to encourage couples to talk about your past, to talk about your upbringing and your family and how your family dynamics were and how your family handled things. because it will help you to understand your spouse and how they respond to things. Mike grew up in a very, they didn't really talk about things. It wasn't there. If there was conflict, it wasn't addressed head on necessarily. And so he's used to just kind of let it flow by, bottle it up type of thing. And the years and years of us being together, I think you've kind of gotten to a different place where you're like, nah, let's just let this out. Why hold it in? I don't have to.
Yeah, I feel like my history was more like everybody blow up and then it just blows over and kind of you just forget about it, whether you got resolution or not.
Okay.
At least you blew your top off and then everything is over. And you're very different. You're very like attack things head on. Anything bothers you, you're gonna talk about it. You don't hold anything back. I think you could probably stand to hold a little bit more back than you do, but
Well, we
that's
can
okay
talk
because there
about
ain't
that when
nothing's getting swept under the rug.
we can talk about that when we get to communication.
Ah,
But
good topic. We'll
good
gotta save
topic.
that.
That's in a couple of weeks, communication and how to communicate with each other. But you're right. Grace is me keeping my mouth shut a little more.
Hmm. I agree,
That is
and we could
grace.
all use a little more grace.
It is. But let's talk about what grace isn't, what grace is
Mm,
not. Grace is not about being a doormat. It's not about things being one-sided. And that's an important point to make when it comes to grace is it's not let everything go, but it is about letting some things go. Don't sweat the small stuff, right? It's about
absolutely. I'm a
practicing what
firm believer in that.
I could probably stand to read that book again, huh?
Probably.
We have it in our library. Go find it for me and I'll read it again. It's really about practicing what God has extended to us and continues to extend us, that he's forgiven us. He's overlooked our failures a million times. Do we do that for each other? Do we do that for our spouses, or do we harbor resentment? You know? And the other thing is, grace doesn't mean that we grant our spouse the permission to do wrong or to hurt us or to lie or cheat or any of that stuff. But it might mean acting gracefully during moments where we are faced with a negative action from our spouse. So it's very important to make that distinction. And we are going to talk about more on that part of things, the hurting and the lying and the cheating, when we talk about forgiveness.
So buckle up for that one, guys.
Yeah, right.
No, I just want to say I think these exceptions are really important, and I know Rebecca thinks they're very important because when we were reading this chapter, she was like, "I don't know if I totally agree with all this. I think you gotta make sure that people know when they're doing you wrong and this and that." And then when we finally got to the exceptions of like, grace doesn't mean you just let somebody do anything they want to do or continue to make the same mistakes or continue, there's some exceptions there. Like
Mhm,
we all need grace, but there's certainly a line where things are right and wrong.
mhm.
There's certainly a line where you're going too far and it's like you're a little outside of what maybe not God's grace, but you can be outside of what's should be allowed between you and your spouse.
Yeah. Yeah. What Mike is referring to is in the Reengage book. First of all, this is my own personal opinion. I kind of feel like they soft pitch it for the first half and then they start to get into it, which I think now that we're past the first half, it does make sense why they do it that way, because it's like you're in these groups of people that you don't know, you're getting to know each other, you're building up to the hard stuff. But I guess me being my personality, I'm like, let's get to the hard stuff right now, right away, immediately, day one, let's go. And so that was part of it, was that grace came in the workup of this, but also that grace came before the forgiveness chapter in that book. And it was very like, be gracious, extend grace. Like, even if they're mean and wrong and a jerk, just like be gracious. And I'm like, no, we can't just always extend grace, if someone is wrong or if someone is sinning or hurting somebody, you don't just let it go. And so, yeah, I definitely was glad when they started to talk about what grace is not, just like what forgiveness is not, what forgiveness is and what it isn't. We're going to talk about that. But
Rebecca doesn't fool around. She's pretty hardcore. For anybody who doesn't know her really well, she used to race motorcycles, and so she's super hardcore. And I knew her for a couple of years before I saw her on the motorcycle track, and I didn't know her until I saw her just flying around on this little rocket. And yeah, she's super hardcore. She don't let anything fly. Somebody's messing with her, she gonna let you know.
it's interesting because I've changed a lot over the years. I used to be a very insular, peacemaking type of person growing up, and I didn't explode or I didn't address things head on. And I think it was because I was happening around me so much that I didn't like conflict. It gave me a lot of anxiety. But what ended up happening is because I didn't address things and because I was bottling that anxiety, I realized one day the only person that I was hurting was myself because I wasn't truly communicating with other people around me. I wasn't truly having real, solid conversations. And so I did the opposite. I like went from being this insular, peacemaking, never say the wrong thing type of person to being like, let's talk about this. This is how this makes me feel. And
One
and it
day
can
a
be a little
switch went off.
much. What's that?
One day a switch went off. She just
Yeah.
bit her tongue for too long, and then everything was different.
Everything was different. But you didn't know me. You didn't know me back then. I
Everything
think sometimes you
changed.
wish you did.
Yeah, I think I probably got you on the tail end of that.
Yeah.
And then it just everything solidified when we were together.
Yeah, because there was a lot of grace and forgiveness that needed to be extended, huh?
Yeah, and there was zero peacemaking. It was it was just all straight up.
We'll save all the dirt for next episode. So if you want to know about Mike and I's dirt, you're just going to have to tune in next week. We had a pretty tumultuous first few years together. And, a lot of people do. And that's why we want to talk about marriage because we feel like we've been through all of it, you guys. We've had amazing times together. We had that storybook romance in a lot of ways, but we also have been through a lot of pain and hardship together too. And we were just talking about this in the kitchen the other day. Like that's what makes marriages. That's what makes your marriage is how you handle those hard times, going through those hard times together, building the strength of your relationship in the hard times. You can't have the mountains without the valleys type of thing. If it was just all fun and cupcakes and roses all the time, what would we learn? What would we grow from it? And first of all, that's also impossible, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
your marriage is forged in the fire and the hardship. I really think that's true because anybody could be together when times are good, and anybody could stick together during the honeymoon and when everything's happy and cupcakes and roses. But what's really important is how you come together when things are hard.
definitely. So to wrap this up, to me, choosing grace is choosing to emulate Christ. And as you said, it's about loving unconditionally. It's about undeserved love, extending undeserved love. And yeah, so I mean, my challenge for anybody listening is really just do a little bit of an examination. Are there areas or times or moments where you could extend some grace to your spouse? And again, we're working on the circle. So please don't go to your spouse and say, you need to extend more grace. Listen to this podcast. No, I do want you to send it to them to listen to, but we only grow by changing ourselves. We only grow together as a couple. I can't force Mike to change and he can't force me to change. But if I change myself, if I improve in the area of grace, for example, he's going to notice that. and he's going to extend that grace too. Just like when it comes to taking care of each other and doing things for each other. You go out of your way to do something for your spouse, and then they notice that and they go out of their way to do something for you. And you don't do it so that that'll happen, but it's just this natural thing that kind of happens. Anyway, any last words on grace?
Yeah, so my take on grace is that we are called to extend grace to our spouse just as Jesus gave us the grace that we didn't deserve. And I think it's a really beautiful gesture. And like I said before, I really do think that this is the most important piece of a marriage is truly extending grace to your spouse because you need unconditional love in a relationship and things are not always going to be perfect. And for every wrong or every little thing that your husband or wife does to you, you can't be looking to check off the scoreboard and say, like, you did this to me, you did that to me. And like true love keeps no accounts. It keeps short accounts. And I really think that grace is so important. And all the other things that we're talking about in this series are built on a foundation of grace because you'll have forgiveness and you'll have love. You'll have all of that if you can start with grace.
Yes, definitely. I think what you were looking for was from the verse, and it says, "Love keeps no record of wrongs."
Yes.
So don't keep score. Don't keep a record of wrongs. Extend some grace to your spouse. And didn't I quote Elsa before? As Elsa says, let it go. Let it go. Awesome. Well, thank you for talking with me and us about grace. And next week, we're talking about forgiveness. So be sure to stay tuned. We appreciate you guys tuning into this series. So thank you for being on this journey with us. If you'd like to follow along outside the podcast, you can join the mission on Instagram and on Facebook at The Radiant Mission. And if you'd like to watch this in video format, if you're not already, check it out on YouTube. Today, we are going to be closing with Galatians 2, verses 19 through 21. For through the law, I died to the law so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. We're wishing you a radiant week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.